Hello! Welcome back to Howling Winds Haven, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. This is my belated video on classical conditioning. I meant to post it last Friday, and clearly that didn't happen. So, I want to start with a little bit of the history of classical conditioning. This is not anything overly important to the concept, but I'm a firm believer that understanding the history of topics is very important to understanding how to implement the concepts better. So, classical conditioning began with an experiment in the late 1800s. So prior to classical conditioning, prior to the late 1800s, psychology primarily functioned off of a school of thought that was kind of Freudian, where the internal thoughts are what's important, things like that. And that was where we had talk therapy and things like that. The id, the ego, the superego, all the things that Freud talked about. So in the late 1800s, we had a physiologist, actually, named Ivan Pavlov, who was studying digestion, specifically saliva, in dogs. And he somewhat stumbled upon this on accident, where he rang a bell right before he fed the dogs, and noticed that after a while the dogs began salivating to the sound of the bell. And thus we had classical conditioning. Out of classical conditioning, or kind of alongside the discovery of classical conditioning, we had the creation of operant conditioning, which we'll talk about this Friday. We'll do a video about that. And classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and all these things gave way to what is called behaviorism, which is a school of thought around psychology that came after the Freudian, very mentally focused thought. And this idea of psychology was one in which the only thing that was worth studying were things that were observable and measurable, i.e. behavior. And so they basically said that they didn't really want to study anything that was internal, that was not that could not be studied with any sort of scientific rigor, really. And so they only studied observable behaviors. Hence, classical conditioning and operant conditioning being a part of that, where classical conditioning is about the observable behavior of the saliva, and operant conditioning is about modifying the observable behaviors. And then after that, in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, we started getting a little bit away from behaviorism, because obviously behaviorism neglects a large portion of our human experience, which is the internal experience. And so now we've moved into cognitive psychology, which is kind of a mix of that. But the benefits that behaviorism gave us was that it helped psychologists develop, and people within the psychology world, develop ways of adding scientific rigor to our psychological studies. And this is helpful because it means that we can actually study and try to prove certain psychological theories. It helps us develop new therapy methods, and so forth and so on. So behaviorism wasn't bad by any means, but the idea overall of neglecting the internal world of a human and focusing only on the behavior of the human doesn't work out super well for humans or animals. So that's where classical conditioning kind of fits in with the overall timeline of psychology. So now that we have that, we're going to talk about what classical conditioning is. So classical conditioning, in very simplistic terms, is learning by association, right? It's So you essentially have a neutral stimulus that does not cause a reaction at all in that person. So the way that it works is that you have a neutral stimulus. In the case of Pavlov's dogs, it was the bell. This is a stimulus that does not cause a significant reaction in the person or animal. And then you have a stimulus that does cause a response. Some people call it a natural stimulus that does cause a significant response. In the case of Pavlov's dogs, it was the dog food. And by pairing the neutral stimulus of the bell with the natural stimulus of the food, the dogs associated the bell with the food and therefore had their response, their natural response, which was to salivate, when they heard the bell. So that means that the bell became a conditioned stimulus. We condition the dogs to respond to the bell the same way they respond to the food. This is the beginning of all clicker training. When you start clicker training, you first have to classically condition the clicker to the treats. So when the dog hears the click, they get a treat. They hear a click, they get a treat. And you do that enough times and eventually the dog will hear the clicker. The reason that I said in my last video that I consider this a form of emotional modification as opposed to just behavioral modification is really evident when we talk about the clicker, because when we pair the clicker with the treat, not only does the dog begin to associate the clicker with the treat, which would be a form of behavior, but they begin to feel rewarded by the clicker itself. And that is emotional modification. So the dogs are rewarded by the treat, and when they get their treat, they know they've done good, and they feel rewarded by that. And then when the clicker and the treat have been paired together long enough, then eventually the dog will feel rewarded by the clicker on its own. And that is a form of emotional modification. We've changed the dog's emotions in regards to the clicker. So that's the basics of classical conditioning. Now, there's other terms related to classical conditioning because this is a process, one of which being extinction. So eventually, if you continue using the clicker without a treat or without any other form of like good boy, good girl, good things happening, eventually the dog will no longer view the clicker as a reward. That's called extinction. You see extinction in behavior modification a lot with like barking dogs. So when a dog has a tendency to bark too much, we're told, trainers will tell you not to respond to the barking. That's because when the dogs bark, and we engage with them, sometimes animals will briefly try harder at the thing, and this is called an extinction burst. So sometimes if you're able to extinguish a certain behavior, right before the behavior extinguishes, the dog's going to do it a lot. Because previously the behavior was reinforcing, and they want that reinforcement back. So they're going to try really extra hard in that behavior to try and have it reinforced. And when that doesn't work, then the extinction will happen. This is called an extinction burst. And it's pretty normal. You just have to power through it. And it does kind of signal that you're on the right track. So you kind of just got to keep going. Another thing that happens with classical conditioning is this idea of generalizing or generalization, which is where an animal learns to respond to similar stimuli, so words that sound similar. So like if you teach your dog to sit on the command sit, and then you say sit down, and they sit down, and they still sit, or seat, or you got sit down, seat. I do this with my dogs where I end up using whatever cue comes to mind for laying down specifically. So they'll lay down to the lay down, lie down, lay down. Like they've got 4 different commands to lay down, and they will listen to all of them because they have generalized that sound to other things. Generally, though, dogs are really kind of bad at naturally generalizing. However, it is important to note that animals tend to be kind of bad at generalizing. And so you'll see this with dogs or even with horses, where at home your dog listens to all of the commands and is perfect, and they answer immediately and they do the right thing. And then you take them on a walk and all of a sudden they don't listen to any of the commands at all. It's not because they don't want to listen to your commands, it's because they haven't generalized those commands to realize that those words mean the same thing outside of that environment. And so when you hear trainers talk about the importance of socializing, of repeating your training in multiple environments, of trying it in different places, that's why, because dogs frequently need a little help in repeating, in being able to generalize their commands to other places or other environments. On the flip side, there is discrimination, which is what dogs are good at, what a lot of animals are good at, in which they only respond to that one specific cue and ignore all of the others. You see this a lot with service animals and like therapy animals, where they learn, and working animals, where they learn to only respond to a certain person and they won't respond to anybody else. That is discrimination. They are able to discriminate between people to know who their handler is and who it is that they need to be listening to. So anyway, classical conditioning is the foundation of a lot of what we teach our animals, and when in doubt, we tend to kind of go back to this classical conditioning idea, right? We use it in basic training, but we also use it for things like desensitization, which I'll talk briefly about now, but we are going to do a video, probably the one after operant conditioning, where we talk more in depth about desensitization, methods of desensitization, things like that. So desensitization is kind of the act of helping an animal so that it does not react to situations in certain ways. Hence the term, they're not sensitive to the situation anymore. You can do it in a lot of different ways, and some of those ways involve extinction and classical conditioning. But there are other ways that you can desensitize your animal, which is why I wanted to do its own video on it and not have it coupled with classical conditioning. Because even though you can use classical conditioning to desensitize animals, it's not the only way to do it. And I wanted to do a broader video on that. So we'll do that in a few weeks. Let me know if you have any questions. We'll be going over operant conditioning on Friday. So if you want to learn more about that, let me know. So if you want to learn more about the psychology behind animal training, subscribe and like this video. This stuff is super basic. So if you're an animal trainer and you're watching this, you're probably like, I already know all this. But I'm essentially just laying the groundwork for understanding some of the stuff we're going to talk about later. And eventually we'll get into analyzing different training methods and the theories that people claim, like the ways in which trainers claim their method works versus how it's actually working and what's actually happening and whether or not the psychology behind it is correct. The goal of this is not to judge or critique from an ethical perspective the training methods that I talk about. It is simply critiquing it from a psychological viewpoint of, does this method work psychologically the way that it's supposed to? And to understand a lot of that, you kind of have to understand the basis of where most behavior modification comes from, which is classical and operant conditioning. So that's why we're starting here. Okay, we'll see you guys Friday.